All right, John King, how are we doing tonight, man? It's good to see you.
Good to see you too, Quentin. It's been a minute. It's wintertime in South Carolina, so that means it's like a sunny day in Minnesota.
Absolutely. What is the what is the weather like from day to day in South Carolina right now?
Well, today is like a high of 55, low of like 45, a little drizzly with some rain. So, all in all, it's not too bad. I could do without the rain, but I'm not going to complain too much.
That's better than the -5 that I encountered today. Unfortunately, up here in good old Minnesota, we're dying, man. Can't go outside for more than 3 seconds without your fingers getting numb.
Well, watch out for the frostbite. Now I can see why you're sporting that beard.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, dude, John King, people are wondering, why are you and I talking? And to give them a little context, I obviously met you in Florida in the spring of 2019. We'll probably get into that story and all the shenanigans that evolved out of there. But obviously, what I learned when I met you is you're a guy who has spent extensive time in Asia, specifically in Beijing, China, um, where you and I don't think we ever connected or crossed paths, but there might have been some layover at a certain point. But I want to start it off without speaking for you is what precipitated you going to China or Asia? Because I know you started in Taiwan. What was the genesis of that?
Good question. I had a great mentor in undergrad at University of Georgia, and he was a political dissident in originally from Romania under the Ceausescu regime, which is kind of, I guess, textbook for like a notorious brutal dictator. But he escaped. Was a man of mystery for a while, polyglot, really interesting guy, and I kind of became his assistant, and I wanted to learn Chinese. So I said, where should I go? Should I go to mainland China? Should I go to Taiwan? And he had done some research on a small little spit of an island off the coast of Taiwan. He said, you should certainly go there. You can learn traditional Chinese. It's sunny, there are beaches, you can go surfing. And, as an undergrad graduating looking for adventure, I thought, well, that was perfect. That was a lot better and more attractive than what some of my classmates who are graduating were doing, right? Working what they saw as kind of dead end or boring jobs, kind of grinding away. So I went over there to teach English and learn Chinese on the streets, as it were. And then, what was originally a 1 year plan turned into a 12-year odyssey. And eventually, after spending a couple years studying Chinese in Taiwan, went to Hong Kong, went to graduate school there, worked there for a couple years, and then moved to Beijing, started 2013, and was there until late.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Out of the three destinations, you spent the most time in Beijing. Is that accurate?
That is, I spent 6 years, give or take, in Beijing, and it's interesting when people ask me, well, which one did you like best? All of them are, I think you can argue, part of the Chinese world, right? They all speak, some dialect of Chinese. They all identify as Chinese. They all share, a common history and ideology in many respects. But they're all very distinct and different. And I think that despite me, living in Beijing for 6 years, there are really special pieces that are kind of attached to each one of those locations in terms of experience. And it really, depends, what you're looking for, which is like many things in life.
Absolutely. I'd love to I'd love to encapsulate the process of learning Chinese. And I know, you're probably still learning to this day in many ways, but as a guy who, in the last couple of years has really gotten serious about learning Spanish, um, I want to know, like, how was that process for you? Because Chinese, Mandarin to be specific, is very difficult. You're a guy who, during my time spent with you, I was like, wow, this guy is, it's impressive to say the least. What, how, I guess, take me through that journey because again, Chinese is the parallels between, let's say, English and Mandarin. pale in comparison to the parallels between Spanish and English.
Yeah, I think most Americans grow up don't learn a second language at all, right? Or it's very casual and haphazard, which is to say that like America's not very good at second language education. So when you look at most schools who offer typically Spanish, French, and German, I think were the popular ones when I was in middle school and high school. You know, it doesn't take you more than one trip overseas to learn that most Germans have been speaking English for at least almost as long as they've been alive. So, to learn German in the United States doesn't really do you any favors or give you any distinct advantages. And I think that, also Spanish is commonly spoken in the United States, so you can pick that up and, because it is a Romance language and, not so dissimilar from English in many respects, and at least in popular culture, people are exposed to Spanish. People are exposed to French, either in a literature class or even in parts of our language like loan words, where Chinese is totally dissimilar, kind of as you said, which is there are elements of the cultural relationship, kung fu movies, the Chinese buffet diner, but there's a pretty thick curtain in terms of actually, being a participant observer in that language and, kind of, some, I guess, key elements that might transition over. One of the common ones that has kind of transitioned over is long time no see, right? So in Chinese, it's 好久不见, right? It's a literal and direct translation. And that's a Chinese phrase that has kind of worked its way into the English lexicon, right? But beyond little things like that, you don't see a lot. So first of all, Chinese is you don't conjugate any verbs. So in that sense, you don't have the same duress that you would when trying to memorize conjugations of, let's say, German or Spanish. But the trade-off is that Chinese has tones. So and I'll try to, the best example I can give is that in English, tone is implied. So for example, when you use tone in your language in English, it's implying a meaning. For example, this Chinese food is really good, as opposed to this Chinese food is really good, right? So there's an additional meaning that's implied in the way that you're saying those words, whereas in Chinese, tone is implicit to the meaning, which is to say that the way that you say that word, whether it be a monosyllable or multiple syllables, is intrinsic to the meaning of that word. And in Mandarin, 4 tones. So it's first tone, ma, second tone, rising, ma, third tone, falling, rising, ma, and then the fourth tone is falling, ma. So if you do it 1, 2, 3, 4, it would sound something like this: ma, 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 ma. Right? And each one of those monosyllables has a different meaning because the tone that I'm using to say it is implicit to the meaning of that word. So I think intellectually that's a good place to kind of start off. Now, obviously, Chinese uses characters, right? And many of them are ideographic. So for example, if I drew the symbol for fire, it kind of looks like a fire, right? But many of those Chinese characters are not pictographic or ideographic in the sense that when you look at it, you can't immediately recognize what that character means. So a better way to exemplify this is, if you don't know a word in English, how can you find out the meaning?
Is that rhetorical?
Well, we could walk through this exercise. So what if you don't know a word, how do you find out the meaning of that word?
I think dictionary. I would go to a dictionary. Is that a fair thing to say?
I think it is a fair thing to say. Now, I guess in the modern age, we'd probably say Google, right? Well, I just go to
Yeah.
Google. What does this mean? Right? But traditionally, you'd pick up a dictionary, right? You'd look at the first letter, and then the second letter, and then the third letter, and then you'd find the word and you would read the definition, right? Because you can recognize those letters that make up that word, and then you can divide them down or put them together and reference it in the dictionary. Well, Chinese is not like that. There are methods of reference in terms of if it takes 12 pen strokes to write a character, you can look at all the Chinese characters that have 12 pen strokes, which could be hundreds, right? And try to work your way through the lines and figure out which one. But you can't sound out a character, right? You might have an educated guess because there are many characteristics that certain characters share in terms of pronunciation, but you can't, as we say in English, sound it out, right? So if you see a character, you can't be like butter, like that doesn't work like that. So you either know a character or you don't. And if you know it, great. If you don't, you've got some learning to do. And that is one of the things that makes Chinese, I think, challenging in addition to the tones.
Absolutely. It makes sense. What I mean, so a guy obviously like yourself, more than capable of communicating with the people of the street. What do people I talked with my buddy last week about this, but the propaganda coming from the US regarding China, it's a bit misleading, without getting too into it or too political. What do Chinese people think of America? Or better yet, how are your interactions with Chinese people? What did they have to say? Because I'm sure their perspectives on the world are much different than ours.
Yeah, well, my perspective, just to answer, I guess the most pertinent question is my perspective on Chinese people is they're great. Someone told me a long time ago is that they're good people everywhere. You just got to find them. And I think in China there are a lot of people, so naturally there's a lot of good people there. And I try not to levy judgment against people because of what their governments do. Right? That's the mistake that we can all fall victim to. In some ways that we don't really have any control over, which is to say that what your government might posit or position vis-a-vis another government might not necessarily be the sentiment of 100% of those people from that country. And so that's something that's always important to keep in mind. On top of that, I would have to say honestly that Chinese people are much more culturally literate about Americans than Americans are culturally literate about Chinese people. Right? And I think the greatest example is probably America's greatest gift, which is soft power. Right? When I talk about power, I'm talking about movies, music, TV shows, all the trappings that we classify as kind of Western democratic entertainment, that goes a long way in China. When you meet someone who learned to speak English by watching all 20 seasons of Friends, the sitcom, and has never been to an English-speaking country, it's kind of freaky, but it's also quite impressive. And I would ask an American, what foreign TV show do you love so much that you could learn that language well from it? Right? And I don't think a lot of Americans would have a good answer. I think the closest I've come across is, right, that's a motivating force. So, that would be my perspective on Chinese people in general. But also, Americans don't have a very good grasp, I don't think, on what the day-to-day life is for most Chinese people, in good and bad. Whereas, if you look in America at any given time, there are hundreds of thousands of Chinese students, undergraduate and graduate. It might be a little bit lower than that, but certainly tens of thousands And all of them are very literate in what's going on in America, and they're taking that back to China to share.
Certainly, certainly. And all your time in China, and without getting, I mean, obviously, we're not looking to name names or anything like that. Did your Chinese language skills ever lead you down the romantic path, should we say, where you dated a Chinese woman and you were speaking exclusively in Mandarin? Was that ever did that ever occur?
Well, I have to give a lot of credit to some wonderful ladies that I knew and dated over the years, and I think that each one of them provided certainly building blocks to improving my language. I had and I don't think any of them are going to watch this, so we'll just name names. I had this great woman named Yo Jing, who was Taiwanese, probably 4'11", 100 pounds, soaking wet, could hike me into the ground, and we used to go, backpacking in the snow-tipped mountains in Taiwan. I mean, it was fantastic, and it's just me and her, and learning Chinese to, in Beijing, dating a girl and going back to like, a northern Chinese village, and like where there's nothing but cold Siberian winds and sorghum stalks, and drinking rice liquor with her grandfather by candlelight. So, those experiences, will stick with me forever. And I think that, obviously humans are curious creatures, right? That's why humans, explore and travel and do drugs and are promiscuous, right? There's a natural curiosity. And I think that all those feelings when you're living in another country are really accentuated, right? Um, I always like to say, every meal a banquet, every walk a parade, right? And everything just has a little bit more sparkle to it, because you don't know what's around the next corner. And I think that extends to, the relationships that I had, not only with, Chinese women, but also women who were not American.
Of course. And yeah, I get that. You made mention just now to being in the northern Siberian winds, that part of China. I'm curious because I'm a guy who's in many ways woefully ignorant about China, even though I lived there for a year. What I mean by that is, so I spent all of like 5 days of my time in China in the capital city of Beijing. And those other 5 days, I was in Shanghai, another international metropolis where there isn't that, there's that like urban culture, but I never like took a train and went out to Western China, for example. So perhaps you could paint a picture of, once you get outside of the westernized major cities, what does China look like?
It's a good question, and it's something that I would encourage anyone who watches this to really, if they have the opportunity to go to China, to really get out of your comfort zone. China is an incredibly safe place. The worst that I've ever experienced is some petty larceny. You might, have your bicycle stolen, right, if you leave it unlocked around the corner. But in terms of violent crime, it's very safe. The way to describe it, Quentin, I would say, is that it's the collision of the 19th and 21st century, where there's been a bridge built between essentially, the late 1800s to the 21st century, where you'll ride a bullet train from Beijing or Shanghai, 1,000 kilometers west, and typically the further west you go in China, the less developed it is. You get into areas such as, Tibet and Anhui and Xinjiang, which, have had the same kind of, I guess, pastoral or sedentary lifestyles for, one could say, thousands of years. So you get off the train station and you see, donkey carts next to Bugattis. You see, homeless beggars with smartphones using QR codes for donations. You see people using digital payment systems, but they don't have internet in their home, right? They just have a mobile device. You see, basically a leapfrog past a lot of kind of the intermediary steps that a lot of Western countries took. So a lot of these have to do with one could argue, superfluous infrastructure, right? So, there's a heavy emphasis on the community and public transport, but a lot of the roads are fairly poor in shape. There isn't great plumbing infrastructure, or rarely will you ever find a house that has central heating or AC, right? But yet everyone has a smartphone device. People are riding electric scooters and using solar panels, to heat water, to water their crops. So it's a weird amalgam of a very traditionalist farming, or rural, we'd say rural lifestyle, with a lot of the trappings that of the 21st century that would be at home in New York, Paris, London, is kind of hip and like cutting edge. So it is kind of disconcerting and strange in that respect. But again, it's also kind of tantalizing, which is you can dip your toe into both worlds. You can go talk to an ancient Buddhist shaman master, and then afterwards you can go play virtual reality games at the new mall around the corner. So it's a little bit of everything for everybody, I would say. But there are people that have never seen, quote unquote, as I like to say, a white face, right? So there's always interesting interactions, because people are curious by nature, particularly Chinese people.
Absolutely. Um, it's interesting because let's say I'll take Minnesota, my state, for example. If you were to go if you were to go to northern Minnesota, you get outside the Twin Cities by, gosh, an hour, 2 hours. You are, you're kind of in that rural territory that we talk about. And the attitudes there are much different than the attitudes in the Twin Cities where I live. What's interesting is it's kind of like a food chain. The attitudes of, let's say, the people who live in the Twin Cities, like if you live in New York City or Los Angeles, you're going to look at the Twin Cities and be like, what is that? Is that just like a place that people lay over on their flight to Los Angeles? Like my question would be, are those places, let's say in Western, more rural China, is there an attitude of like Beijing is, some faraway place that we don't even identify with? Or what are, like, is everyone sort of homogenized in the sense of they all are very, like, they're all following the same path, if that makes sense. Like, because I would certainly imagine the people who live in New York City, they occupy a different mindset than the people who live in South Carolina or Minnesota, for example. Do you notice that in China, or is, like, because we talked about earlier, you touched on earlier, everyone's kind of the same in that sense. Like, like people, no matter which country or government you're under, you're still people and you still operate in relatively the same way. What are some of your thoughts?
I'm going to drop a Chinese idiom to get this going. So, 山高皇帝很远, which means the mountains are tall and the emperor is far away. And traditionally, China has kind of, in throughout history, acted with fairly autonomous regions. We won't get into the political elements of that, but one can imagine in such a luxury that before modern technology and communications, cultures and municipalities kind of developed their own identity, as well as kind of a pride. Just like Minnesotans are proud of how they bear the cold and their ice fishing prowess. You have similar parallels in rural China, and I think that in the same respect, just like many people in the Midwest might aspire to see the world, join the Navy, and or go make it big in New York, you have that same kind of parallel in China, where the small little farmer's son, who does well in the local village school, wants to go join a tech startup in Beijing, right, and make it big. So I think you do have that parity with, quote unquote, the American dream, right? To work hard by your bootstraps. And, in the circumstances that I'm familiar with, and we get some flack for this, but Americans are pretty soft, pretty comfortable, pretty privileged. I've met Chinese people who their grandmothers picked up aluminum cans on the side of the road to save money to buy candles so that their grandson could study by candlelight. You know, I don't really know any stories like that um, until you go back to the Great Depression of the 1920s and 30s here in the United States. So not only are people capable and want to better themselves financially and educationally and emotionally, they're willing to put the work in, and that's something that I think should be taken note of. And you see the roughest places in China, quote unquote, are the most underprivileged in those Western areas, those rural areas where, not too long ago, life was pretty cheap.
Yeah, now the cost of living has simply risen. In comparison to the United States, it's still very affordable. I talked with a buddy recently. It was like, for a three-bedroom apartment, everyone's share was $500 a month. And as an English teacher, you only make $2,000 a month. But that's that's a pretty good ratio. If only a quarter of your paycheck every month is devoted to rent, leaves a lot of wiggle room for other things, especially when you're not paying for a car and things like that. It's funny because in my interactions with various Chinese people, they've sort of commented on what you just touched on, which is the lack or the loss of traditionalism or what used to be. And there's obviously that sort of, there's people who are all about progressing, improving. They like the direction that China is trending, but then there's also people who are like, yeah, we're seeing some of the same problems. Like one person had mentioned higher divorce rates. People now with more income, their kids they were being spoiled and they're putting on weight, to put it generously, which is something we see obviously in the United States. Do you think it's just a human reality? Is we get a little fluffy, we get a little complacent, we don't work as hard when we have the things that we need, or I love the story about the grandma, scrapping to be able to provide candlelight. Is that something that America should feel bad that a lot of Americans don't have to do, or how do you sort of reconcile that?
Um, I think it's something Americans should feel very grateful that they don't have to do, and take note and stock of the privileges and pleasures that you have. But kind of looking at the grander scheme to talk about that issue of the tension between generations past and present, right? Which is, I think humans have a tendency to idealize to a large degree the past, and have trepidation about the future, right? Because the past is known and the future is inherently unknown, right? That's just the nature of time. So there's a sense, I think, a lot of times when, and you mentioned an example, right, which is there's a higher divorce rate in China, that's on the rise. Well, divorce is not such a bad thing if you're the victim of domestic abuse. So there's always more to the story, which is to say that is people in kind of in rosy tinted glasses look, the past is always idealized, right? Because that's really the most palatable way to look at the past, if one can do that. Sometimes the trauma is so great that that's not really possible. But as people work through that progress, the nature of culture is change, right? It is inherent within human culture that things are always changing, oftentimes imperceptibly on a daily basis, but in the aggregate, it's undisputable. So, I always caution others, and particularly myself, we can all fall victim to that kind of languidly looking back at glory days past. But that's the nature of human society. That's the nature of culture. And the question is, as we move forward, where do you want to take that? And I think you can use that criticism of what you would like to see, and you can mold the future in that image, right? But what you can't do is say, well, we need to go back to a static, idealized notion of a past that may or may not have really ever been, right? And I think that, Americans that I know, they suffer from that ill, and cultures around the world are not immune from that, right? So, I always think people should, look critically, and rather than, idealizing the past, concretely and diligently build a future you would like, because you have control over that. And I think Chinese are actually doing a pretty good job at that, despite, you know, obviously the inherent problems that you see and that come up as a result of the world's largest country by population making some big moves, geopolitically, industrially, um, and so forth.
Makes sense. A little bit of a lighter question for you, John. After
Please,
10 after
levity.
10 after 10 or 12 years abroad, which is in my opinion amazing, because after 1 year I was like emotionally exhausted. So the fact that you had the fortitude to persevere and triumph over the course of a decade is commendable, to say the least. But what's your favorite Asian country outside of China?
That's a good question. It's hard to narrow down one, but I would have to say that two really stand out, and one of them is the Philippines, and the other is Vietnam. And I think that Philippines is interesting because it was the only colony of the United States. So for a period, and I think that carries over today. There is a very strong connection and relationship again to that soft power in the Philippines, and it's gorgeous, and the people are great, and the music and the food and the beaches. It's got everything Thailand has, and it's easier to get around and communicate, in my opinion. The other is Vietnam. Also a beautiful Southeast Asian country, right? But the Vietnamese are a very unique people, which is to say that they don't take any shit. They they beat the French, they beat the Americans, they beat the Mongols, and they're very prideful people, but they're also very accommodating people, and great food, beautiful scenery. So, if any of your listeners ever get the chance to try those two countries, I don't think they'll be disappointed.
Certainly. I never got to Vietnam. I heard good things about it. It never happened. Maybe one day, if I ever get a PJ private jet, I'll swing back there. But I
I've never
really,
heard that acronym.
oh, it's pretty popular with NBA guys, but I won't pretend to be one of those. I really love Japan. I love Tokyo. I thought, man, you want to talk about a culture that was the only country that I went to in Asia where I was like, this is a different place. Like it was westernized by infrastructure, but not by culture, if that makes sense. It was very clear and apparent, like the way people behave here, it's so unique and so special. And I was only there a couple of days, but man, if I had to choose a place to go back to, it would obviously be China, but then it'd be Japan, and I know I think it cost me about $500 a day just to have a good time there, but it's beyond the price. It's worth it, man.
Mm.
Japan is awesome.
Well, that is true. I think the there's a podcast, Hardcore History by Dan Carlin, and I love his definition of a kind of Japanese people as a descriptor. I thought this is very apt, which is the Japanese are just like everyone else, but more so. And which is to say that the Japanese have, they have a penchant for quality and perfection, which is, can be equal parts, astounding and mind-boggling and frustrating, right? In trying to interact with that culture. But I agree with you. I think Japan's super hip, and I'm a big fan as well. Hopefully, we'll both get to go back there sometime.
That would be epic, to say the least. Was there a country in Asia that you necessarily weren't a fan of? You went there and like, sure, probably had a good time, but you got on the plane and you went home and you're like, there's something to be desired here.
Hmm. Well, I never, I've never been to a country where I'm like, never again. you Certainly they fall in a pecking order, right? Which is, everyone has their preferences. And some like things that others don't. But I and this isn't a knock against the country. I think it's just a reality that a lot of countries struggle with, which is, Cambodia can be a pretty rough place. And not because it's super dangerous or it's bad. It's just, there's a pretty high degree of poverty that most Americans have never been exposed to, and that parlays into inconvenience in travel and accommodations and food cleanliness and all kinds of little, really at the end of the day, inconsequential things, right? But and there are also beautiful parts of Cambodia. So I can't really say that I ever went to any country in that region where I'm like, nope, never again. I think we all have kind of, our top three or four that, in a limited lifetime that we have, that we're probably going to prioritize over others.
Yes, I would agree. That's interesting. If I were to answer that question, I would say Cambodia as well. I actually had a really good time there, and I stayed in a hotel, a nice hotel, as opposed to just some, $10 a night Airbnb. But there was, yeah, Cambodia was, yeah, I think you touched on a little bit the poverty, like the infrastructure just wasn't there. Um, but there was some awesome people. The food was, it wasn't. I'm not even a foodie, but I was a little bit like underwhelmed. And I would say Cambodia. So it's interesting to hear you touch on that. But I agree, man. It's really hard to go to a place and then get to the airport to go home and you're like, yeah, never again. Like I'm not doing it. It's rare in many ways. Like, I mean, if you can't have fun on vacation, you should probably just never go on vacation.
Well, I think this is probably something you and I both learned, Quentin, is that most of the assholes stay in their own country, right? And so the people that you meet traveling and also the people that like interacting with travelers, that's a self-selecting group of people, right? Which is something I think you forget when you're in that zone and you're doing that thing, which is to say is that, the people that are interacting with you and you with them, that's a choice. And, it can be intoxicating, right? And invigorating. Even I consider myself kind of an introvert, but I really get charged up also with interacting with people that I feel like I share a commonality with or an experience with. So, for travel for me is intoxicating, truly.
Of course, it's like you said, intoxicating, invigorating, all those things. But of course, you're in South Carolina. I'm in Minnesota, which is to suggest that we both decided at a certain point in time, John King, to leave. Why did you ultimately depart from mainland China?
It's a good question. I, I'm surprised you didn't slip in there, Quentin, that Minnesota and South Carolina are the two greatest states in the union. But we'll get to that later. We'll get to that later. I left China as a result of kind of some bad luck in a job. I thought I was going to get an equity stake in a business. And not only was that not forthcoming, but as a way to prevent them having to do that, I was let go. And so, and this is in the dead of winter, which, yeah, maybe not quite as severe as a Minnesotan winter. It's a pretty dark time in Beijing. Uh, so I spent 5 months kind of looking for that next perfect job. And the promise I made myself was, if I didn't find that perfect job, then I would, give a go of it back in the United States for a bit. And that time elapsed, and I had a couple interviews that still was kind of interesting, but didn't really, get me going. And 12 years is a long time. You forget that, if you have like, nieces or nephews, when you haven't seen them like in this past year for like 1 year, you're like, you grew like 8 inches. Like, when you times that by 10, right? People forget what you look like. If you haven't seen them in, 10 or 12 years, parents were getting older. So, I think here's the greatest thing, and this is the saving grace, Quentin, I think about traveling and particularly living abroad, right? Is that the people who have done it, right? You know that deep down within yourself, you can do that. And that at the end of the day, if everything here turns to shit, you can always fall back on that possibility, right? And my kind of, I guess, fill in the blank was, I can always go back to Taiwan and teach English for 40 grand a year and live on the beach and be happy, right? That's not a bad fate. And people who have never done that, right, never lived outside of their comfort zone, outside of their culture, the older you get, the more reticent people are to try that. And the stronger that fear of failure is. So, when my buddies lose their job at the tire factory in rural Georgia, right, they don't see going to Taiwan to live on the beach and teaching English as a possibility, right? Because it's too foreign, too scary. But I know, through my experience and of course yours, that's always on the table, right? So I think, expats who come back to America can take heart, right? That what the other side of the fence looks like, right? And if you ever want to open up that gate and go back, there's a possibility to do that. And I think for me personally, in this past year of pandemic, certainly I've had moments of regret where I'm like, why did I ever leave China? I think arguably you could say China's done a pretty good job of tamping down the virus where people have gone back to normal, where, in America, largely in many places, is still kind of a shit show, for lack of a better expression. There isn't really a unified response of solidarity. So, and I think it's all relative, of course, but, that's why I left China originally. And, there's also, and this, Quentin, which is there are some jobs that exist in Asia that have no parallel back in the home country, right? So, for example, if you are an English teacher who has a fake college degree from some university in the Western Hemisphere, have never taught English before, don't know how to teach, as long as you fit the bill, right, you might be able to squirm your way into a decent paying position with some great perks, right? And if you try to bring that scenario back to America, they'll laugh you out the door, right? Because you don't have a teaching certificate, you don't have a real degree, you don't have quote unquote real experience. So there also is a fear, I think, that for many expats that, you can Peter Pan your way through a lot of years living abroad, but if you're not building real skills and you're not working towards a concrete goal, right, that's going to have some longevity, doors of opportunity close as you get older. And, I think, unfortunately, when you go through the job market in America, not all Americans are incredibly open and understanding regarding international experience that doesn't fit within a very narrow mold, right? Which is, oh, you spent 18 months at the Shanghai Microsoft headquarters. All right. That's something they can contextualize. Whereas, many jobs that people or expats have in Asia, it doesn't go like that.
Absolutely. I don't know if people saw me, but I was laughing, trying not to be loud so the camera didn't cut to me. But yes, that reminds me of a certain massage therapist who I met in Beijing, who was like, yeah, I make a good money here. I'm a 10-year vet, da da da. And I was just like, well, how did you get here? She's like, yeah, I never went to college. And I'm like, oh, well, I thought you had to have a degree. She's like, yeah, I just printed one off on like the internet or something like that. And I was just kind of like, all right. And this is back in like my Tinder heyday, so I wasn't like none too bothered. But with the grace of age, I'm now looking back on it like, geez, that chick was a little psycho. But that's besides the point. Yeah, man, I think if you undergo it's G Easy has this great line, the lonely path to greatness. which is so true. It's just like, if you want to undertake something where you're doing something that doesn't involve like, hey, I'm going to go get my 4-year degree, then I'm going to take like an unpaid internship, and then I'm going to really climb the corporate ladder. If you're not willing to do that, well, a lot of people kind of look at you like, well, why aren't you willing to do that? Like, why would you go to China? Why would you go to Taiwan? Why would you do this? That's not really looking great on the resume. But again, one thing I've always admired about you, John, is your ability to just pursue what you want to pursue. And I like to think I embody that same mentality, which is like, look, like I might not be following the narrative that society has played out for me or laid out for me, excuse me, but I'm doing what I want to do. And maybe that eventually will really bite me, but I like to think there's a balance that can be struck. And it's interesting. And I suppose I'll just kind of transition that into, I guess, the genesis of our ultimately meeting, which is, I'm slated to go back to China. This is March 2019. I come home to Minneapolis. I'm in between contracts, signed on with a new company. I got 3 weeks, so I'm going to see my parents, have a good old time, whatever. Well, about 2.5 weeks in, I get a WeChat message from my new boss, and she's like, "Hey, could you come down to Florida?" And she's like, "I got jet skis, I got this, I got that." And I'm thinking, well, it's about -10 degrees in Minnesota at the time, so I'm like, "Absolutely, I will come down to Florida." I'm like, "Well, what about me going back to China? When's that going to happen?" She's like, "Ah, yeah, a month. We'll give it a month." And we go through a laundry list of like weird things that happened in my like first, I'll say, 3 days there that really kind of had me scratching my head. Thank God you intercepted after about a month, like of me being trapped in that house. How did you end up? And I'm trying to be delicate. I don't want to like name names, but how did you end up in, let's just call it, the American Horror Story?
Okay. I would call it the American Horror Story with Chinese characteristics, Quentin. So, good question. We shared a mutual acquaintance, a good buddy of mine, actually, who was a teacher at this Chinese lady's school in Beijing, and she had made her fortune by opening a lot of English schools. I, at that time, was also, as we say, in between contracts, trying to cement my feet into the higher education realm here back in the United States. So, like you were kind of attracted to warmer weather and, a good payday. I got the same pitch, which was come down, work on this English language project for these kids, and we got a place for you to stay. We got an office for you to film in. We got an assistant to work the gear. It seemed pretty legit on the surface. And also, beggars can't be choosers, as they say. So why not take a trip down to crazy Florida land? So, we get there. And, I think the thing that stunned me is that this house is a historic house. It was built by the first director of the Ringling Brothers Circus Museum, right? So that's the hint. But a gorgeous palatial estate with, a guest house and all that. So that seemed good until you met the people living inside the house. Present company excluded, of course.
Appreciate it.
A myriad tale and sordid twists of chicanery and double dealing and two-facedness. Again, don't want to go too deep into that, but it was interesting to say the least. So I remember meeting you. I'm like, okay, great. This guy seems like he's not insane, like these other two people who live in this house. Perhaps we can commiserate and join forces to maintain our sanity. And I think that's really how it started, if memory serves.
You're right. You're exactly right. I need to get my composure here and stop laughing. Yes, that's exactly what happened. I mean, so before you got there, like just to give the audience a quick like idea of what happened. Like long story short, this individual had a life partner who was worthless for all intents and purposes. And I remember like a private investigator had come over to the house, and I was like, dude, I don't speak Chinese, but I ended up being like a translator for this guy, which, as you can imagine, not too cool. And basically, I after like that conversation, I was then told by my present employer, hey, do not like tell this like far away life partner of mine that like I hired a private investigator. And she told me this after I had already like texted the mystery person. It was like, just so you know, we're trying to find you. And that was probably like my fault. But I'm just one of those guys where like the truth is the truth. Like I really don't know. I can't lie. It's really hard for me to do. Like, I mean, I'll lie because I'm a human being, but like in this case, um, it was just like I have to tell her. Like I have to tell her. Like I already told this guy. Otherwise, I'm just gonna be living with this agony of like Jesus. So I told her, and then she, in the Chinese word for why, if people are curious, is Wei Shama, and I probably messed up the pronunciation. Don't kill me, but she was just running around the living room as I'm sitting there in a chair, just like frozen. Like, is this woman gonna stab me? And she's just like, Wei Shama, Wei Shama, Wei Shama. Like, why is this guy like? Why did you tell him? And I'm just kind of like. So then she calls her son, who speaks English, and is like, I'm having a dialogue with him, and the son's like, why did you tell this guy? Why did you tell? I'm like, look, dude, I'm just kind of here, man. Like I was told there was jet skis. You know what I mean? Like, dude, I signed up like again, this is in Tinder heyday, so I'm thinking, all right, man, like I'm gonna go to St. Pete, Clearwater Beach. I'm gonna get me a good old honey. I'm gonna like go to the bars. I'm gonna have a good old time in Florida. Then I'm gonna go back to China. Well, basically, it turned into like Tinder is basically like the Sahara Desert in the middle of Florida, unfortunately. So don't ever invest in that if you're like a single guy. And yeah, like the jet skis never happened. That was the most disappointing part. But and help me
Mhm.
out here. It's sad when the coolest place you can go is called the Gator Club.
Gator Club. You know, I'm from the South, technically, Quentin, and we always categorize Florida as an addendum, a hanger on, something that is not of that world. And just frankly, there's some crazy, crazy people in Florida, right? And it's very tribalistic. And there were some tribes hanging out at the Gator Club for sure. But I think what stunned me is, when you see dysfunctional people operate, right? And they have gone through, they've kind of rehearsed their roles, right? Where they're putting on a performance. And the mistake that people often make who have rational minds will, at the beginning, take the time to walk them through their agony or their pain and their grief, only to realize that those people are not interested in solving that problem. And in fact, the goal is the perpetuation of that narrative and that grief and that drama, because that is what fuels them as people. Right? And I think that's something that you and I both kind of got to see, which, they had done that dance so many times. And if you can follow the hint we gave earlier, you can certainly find some awesome mug shots of people getting arrested as a result of that fucked up relationship. So, but that's Florida. I'm sure all your listeners are familiar with Florida Man, right? That's We got our own personal dose Florida Man in this home. So me and Quentin here, we bonded in our defense of the insanity and hurricane around us while we filmed lessons for little Chinese children to be, I guess, shown to them at a later date in an abandoned strip mall that used to be a pet store, which, from what I understand, Quentin, in Florida, that sounds like a descriptor for another kind of filming, but that might be for another podcast. So, as we show up and film these videos every day with a Chinese assistant who is an art student who also does not know what's going on, there was some camaraderie in the chaos. Uh, you know, me, and his English name, Badass. Um, you know, who rode a Harley motorcycle and was our cameraman. Um, you just can't make that stuff up. It's just too good. I taught him how to drive a car too. He knew how to drive a motorcycle, but he didn't know how to drive a car. So that was my contribution to his well-being.
When people ask me why do you write memoirs, I say it's better than fiction, bro. Because like you said, you can't make that shit up. Yeah, badass. What a guy. What a guy. Still follow him on Instagram. He posts photos every once in a while. Yeah, when you talk about those videos, I just think like we're sitting in, like you said, an abandoned strip mall, um, making videos. Like you are literally every 30 minutes wiping down this grimy ass chalkboard just so you can like write more like words on it, just so that you
Oh
like, and
boy.
this thing by the hour is getting more and more just infiltrated with dust and like I'm thinking in my head, I'm like, I don't know anything about videography, but this looks like shit and no one is gonna buy this. And you know, as beautiful as you are, John King, and as much as you know, really just capture the screen, I'm thinking, man, like
Mm.
once they finally get bored of looking at you, they're gonna notice this disgusting chalkboard and they're gonna ask for the refund. And it was one of those things where we're in the strip mall. I remember they didn't have air conditioning for a while, so you're sweating like a pig, and you're only like saving grace is this like bagel shop that's 2 feet to the right, and you're like, wow. So yeah, we're really in it now. But dude, I gosh, I how about that little dog that just kind of walked around the property? And it was this is what I called American Horror Story because there was like something at every turn. There was a little dog that had to be like 3 pounds, literally walking around the house with a limp. There was like a $10,000 cat that was apparently the crown jewel. The other cat had no hair. It was just like it was a thing. I don't even know what it was called. And
That was a
then,
creepy little critter.
dude, again, you cannot script this stuff. And I just remember our benefactor in this instance. She would come home and like be like, "Oh, I just spent $500 on these wooden like antiques," and I'd be like, "It looks like something I would create in woodshop class." You know, it was just kind of like, "Who sold you that?" And like, why did you buy it? Yeah, man. I was also the guy who had to deal with like the air conditioning guys when they came over, like the electrical guys, and they're all talking to me again, dude. I'm translating and I don't even speak Chinese. And they're just like trying to sell me the most expensive products. I'm just like, you know what? This woman probably has more money than she knows what to do with. Just do that. You know, like just give me whatever so you don't ever have to come back. All of which is to say, like, dude, you arrived and it's like, finally, man, finally someone to go with to the Gator Club with and chase around like these Florida chicks who like I don't get along with. That is one way of sort of encapsulating the time
Mm.
before, well, the whole time in Florida, I would say.
Trial by fire makes the greatest friendships, Quentin. And I think we certainly had some good times there. You know, I got you into rock climbing, right? Which is funny to say in Florida, but we made the journey up to St. Pete 3 times a week. You became quite a good rock climber. You met some beautiful honeys there as well, as I recall. So you know, I think there are some positive points in the end, but maybe if for nothing else, that it gave us the requisite motivation to get out of that insane house, uh, which you know, for all we know, into the ground already. Um, it's quite a tale, but you know, it was formative and informative. Formative in making your mind resolve to do greater things and move the yardstick along, as they say, and informative on how crazy some people can be.
Quite literally. Quite literally. Yeah, man. The rock climbing, that's obviously the first thing I think of when I think of like, dude, you and I, we'd go rock climbing, we get some wangs after, and you know, it'd be a good time. Absolutely. I remember, yeah, like you said, there were some cute chicks there. And I remember, I don't know why, but this really attractive woman, she wanted to go out with me. And I ended up going to the beach, right? Well, to get there, I took like this 1995 Ford Taurus that I was, given by my lovely employer. So I drive to, Clearwater Beach, have a good time with this
Classy
woman, and
ride.
yeah, we have a good time. And I'm thinking, all right, awesome. I'm gonna go have a nice car ride home. And I kid you not, I turned the car on and I couldn't even put the car in gear. It had already broken. And I'm like, oh gee. So in a panic, I go over to Chick-fil-A, drown my sorrows and the chicken nuggets and barbecue sauce. And I call you. I'm like, dude, I know you're not a mechanic, but why would a car simply not go into gear? And then long story short, a tow comes. This I'll call him a gator. He ends up talking my ear off for like 50 whole minutes on the drive back. I get back, and then my boss is like, "What the fuck? Why would you take that car to St. Pete?" And I'm like, "Oh, I mean, it's a car. What do you mean?" She's like, "It's only for like
Right.
going. It's only for going downtown." I'm like, "Oh, okay. Well, that would have been nice
Mhm.
to know when you gave it to me that it can't go, 40 minutes one way." And dude, needless to say, never saw the hot chick again. Um, and I had to like pay for some guy on like in a chop shop to fix it. And it's just like, yep, it's time to leave Florida, man. It's time to leave Florida. Like you say, um, and dude, tough times make tough people. Yeah, I'll never forget that little instance in my life.
Mm. Well, it was good, and the money was good. We'll put it like that. So it was better than many alternatives could have been, given the circumstances. But I chalk it up as a adventure that now we get to laugh about, and I made a great friend out of it. So there's that too.
Absolutely, bro. Absolutely. And the pleasure is all mine. I really do appreciate that friendship. I also appreciate you coming on and having a conversation with me tonight, John. I know we're terming this a podcast, but whatever it is, it's always cool to just connect with people and have a conversation.
Absolutely. Well, hey, I really appreciate you, invite me on, and hopefully, your followers and listeners will, at the very least, be entertained. Right. That's all that we can do. And I always love chatting you up, man. I always enjoy the conversation and matching wits with you. You're a smart guy and doing good things. So hope it continues.
Yeah, I appreciate that, John. I appreciate that. Absolutely, man. I appreciate the time. Let's stay in touch. Hopefully, dude, hopefully I'm back down in Myrtle Beach at some point this year.
You got to get down to the Dirty Myrtle, maybe. I got my sailboat, 34-foot ready. She sleeps 5, so that's me, you, and 3 cute ladies. There you go.
I
You're a
saw you
man of
wearing a
maths.
parka.
Well, the winter, man. Give it 2 months. It'll be 90 degrees. We'll be out there on the beach drinking coconuts and rum.
Hey, I like that idea. I like that idea. The ocean was warm when I was down there last year. I'll say that.
See, there you go. Just imagine that.
All right, John. Thanks for the time, bro. We'll see you. We'll hopefully see you later this year.
For sure, man. I'll catch you soon.
All right. Peace.